So I'm going to kick off by first just saying to everyone who is joining, registered, watching this at a later time, thank you so much for being here. This is our wellness webinar. Every month I provide you with a topic, wellness topic, and because September is Healthy Aging Month, I wanted to talk a little bit about what that means and also share with you, if you are not entirely aware of, what these things around the world called the blue zones. So I'm going to advance through the slides. I'll check the chat. We have some time for Q&A as well. So let me just share with you first a little bit about what we expect to cover in today's conversation. And I'll give you some housekeeping things as well. So we're going to go over some of the common lifestyle factors that can contribute to longevity. We'll talk a little bit about how that differs from America versus the rest of the world. We'll also look a little bit more in depth about social well-being and taking away some of the factors or the principles that we see in some of these areas around the globe that we can maybe include in our own daily practices. So here is our housekeeping list of items. You've seen me doing this before. Obviously, as you enter in, you can hear the announcement that the session is being recorded. You can use the chat anytime. I am the only person moderating this webinar, so if I don't see your chat immediately, I'll go in and I'll check it as the slides advance, and there will definitely be time for a more formal Q&A at the end of the discussion. Even though we set aside an hour, I usually stop around the 40 to 45-minute mark to allow for any open conversation. As I tend to disclaim, I always disclaim in these webinars, please make sure you're taking this just to be your educational, informational, and entertainment. Anything that you take away that you might consider doing something different in your own health and wellness pursuits, please don't consider this medical advice. Make sure you're speaking to your own wellness providers, healthcare providers, etc. Also get medical clearance if you are going to be including any changes or implementing any changes into your current state of affairs, and especially in the world around physical activity or pharmaceuticals. Please make sure that you're getting clearance from your doctor. At the end, usually within about a couple of days to a week, at the end of this webinar, I'll capture the recording and I'll send out a link to the recording and a link to a follow-up survey so that you can give us some feedback and let us know if there are other topics that are interesting to you so that we can take that into consideration in the next months to come as we put together future topics and webinars. So if you've never met me before, this is me. I'm Dina D'Alessandro. I am a registered dietitian nutritionist based out of New York City, and I also work out of Ocean County, New Jersey, but you can definitely find me on the virtual platforms or the virtual space as Dish with Dina. And my background covers a lot of things around mostly diabetes prevention and managing chronic conditions, but I have worked with a variety of patient populations, age ranges, and different clinical conditions in the course of my last 8 years of being a dietitian. So I'm very happy and proud of the work I've been doing. I'm very excited that I get to work with such a large amount of people, and I learn something new every day. And I also mentor and precept, I supervise dietetic interns, nutrition students, volunteers, and I am an adjunct lecturer of nutrition studies as well here in the Bronx at Lehman College, which I know a lot of you who are joining tend to be from there. That's how you know me. So thank you for coming in and thanks for letting me be a part of your life. Before we get in here, let me just quickly check. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for your note. You're very welcome. I'm glad that you find these beneficial. Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about what this language means around the word longevity and what it comes down to as to how we can live as long as possible or what helps us live as long as possible. A lot of times we'll see things, and I'll talk about this in this conversation as well, that, I tend to make sure we're not necessarily focusing on 100% responsibility of the individual because there are so many other factors involved. Things like quality healthcare, access to certain things. Yes, genetics plays a role, but as you can see here, it's a small percentage of potentially putting you at risk for something, but things to keep in mind. Then we also have your environmental factors, like things that you are susceptible to or exposed to. And then about 51% ties into lifestyle factors. But even within that, we can say that not everything is necessarily your fault or your responsibility, because some of those factors that we consider might be a little hard to come by or hard to access, depending on how you live and where you are. I also want to define a little bit or share with you some statistics before we launch into the main part of the presentation about our current life expectancy. This is much higher, obviously, now than it was back in 200 years ago in the 1800s when people were only living to be about 38 to 40 years old. But this actually has gotten this has decreased in the last few years because of COVID and COVID related side effects and illnesses. So we were pushing at about 78 to 80-ish as the average life expectancy. Now you can see it's back down to about 76 years. And globally speaking, case by case basis, different regions, obviously every place in the world has a different reason what helps them or hinders people from getting older. So if you think of the things that you've seen, you've gone through, people in your world, think about some of the factors that were involved in doing that. I have a little note here as far as places in Africa, their average life expectancy is about 61. In India, it's about 67. So again, you take into account those lifestyle factors or other environmental issues, and a lot of where we live around the globe does definitely takes place or takes a toll on how our body reacts to those things. We can also say the advancement of the ability to live a little bit longer than quite significantly longer than we were 200 years ago is for the advancement of things around science and technology, things like sanitation and vaccinations, environmental protections. Pros and cons with a lot of this, whether we consider this to be, positive or negatively influenced. We'll talk a little bit more about that too as the slides progress. But I also like to always wrap in here too, especially since at the time of this webinar and recording, this is a pretty big election year, but also just generally speaking, knowing who your elected officials are, who your representatives are, knowing what kind of agenda items that are important to you, are they in line with what is important to them? So that's something that I just want to tout as kind of a public service announcement as you get to research and know a little bit more before you vote. This is not a great visual because it's a little hard to see, but you can see the colors hopefully from top to bottom, which is basically an overview of the life of a typical American, where most of the time at the very top is us going to school if we have access to education. That part in the middle, that red section there, is your professional life. In typical American fashion, we usually start our careers or our professional lives around the time when we end college, around 2022. That might be a little different for you or other people. And then usually we retire around the age of 65 or so. It's getting a little higher as I talk to some people who are unable to retire due to, financial circumstances or responsibilities. But that little purple section is quote unquote retirement, where maybe when that comes to your place in life, or if you're already there, that might be something that you're like, yay, can't wait for that to happen. Or maybe you're not looking forward to it because you might feel like, great, now I have nothing to do. But I just thought this was an interesting visual representation of, again, kind of how our life in weeks and years progress, and how sometimes maybe we feel like things are going to be very serious or concerning. And when you look at this as far as, whether you think life is very short or very long, totally up to you. But I just thought this is kind of interesting. Like, okay, where am I right now? And how much longer do I have left? And what am I doing with my time? So let's talk a little too about the definition around what is health, to be healthy. Some of the surveys that I've done in the past, and when I speak with my patients, clients, my students, and maybe also you, if you want to chime into the chat, you can think of the definitions that you use. We're not necessarily saying that to be healthy means not to have disease or clinical condition or a mental health condition, or perhaps you have physical disabilities. Just because you are managing something doesn't automatically maybe qualify you as unhealthy. But of course, in America, we do have certain criteria as far as healthcare provisions and reimbursement for insurance that they might use different terms than we do. But along that right-hand side there, the language, again, is very vague, right? Well-being, vitality, balance of things, active lifestyle. What does all this stuff mean, and what does it mean to you? And we're going to see a little bit too about how we define it going forward when we take a look around the globe. This also provides me with an opportunity to, once again, I try to include this information in almost every webinar about what is known as the social determinants of health. So as I was saying before, is it the individual's responsibility to make all these choices, to be as healthy as possible and to do everything right if they don't have access to the following things. So if you agree with me, right, that there are systemic inequities, there are issues, especially in the case of our country, and maybe also along, other parts of the world as well, where there might be economic instability, there might be issues with the environment and infrastructures of things, lack of food access, quality and quantity, etc. All of those things can play a role, which adds up to that percentage, that 51% and etc. is being taken into account here. So again, this helps with maybe helping us understand a little bit better of how we can voice our concerns, how we can advocate for better quality policies and programs, and be a little bit more engaged or interactive, that if somebody else is struggling, that we can maybe step in and help with resources in some way, whatever feels appropriate to us. Another thing to share with you is how America defines old. How do we define this age range? When we are born at the age of 0 as a newborn up until the age of about 20, we're considered pediatrics. That's the pediatric population. We're still considered children in there. From about 20 to about 60, that's considered, young adult to adult age range. And then depending on the organization and the program or the services that are provided within the things that you can see in here from just not America also, but the World Health Organization too, of how they say, okay, this is now when these senior populations, or what used to be known as the elderly population, older adults, this is now how we define that next category of our life cycle. So the Older American Act Nutrition Program is people are eligible once they hit 60 years old. You're also eligible for Medicare once you hit 65 years and older. And then at that bottom bullet, as an example, on my end, as a dietitian, when we're giving nutrition information, nutrition advice, assuming all things considered and somebody's not dealing with a lot of moving parts as far as chronic illnesses, a lot of our recommendations of the quantity of foods and the micronutrients, things that people need to maintain that life cycle, comes at the age of 70 and older. So we switch our recommendations at that age, kind of delineation there. All right, I'm going to share with you too, because I always love diving deep into the science of things when we talk about what happens on a cellular level. And as I was mentioning before, yes, okay, you may play a role in things, but sometimes our body does what it's going to do. So the way that my friend, who's a genetic counselor, explained this to me was kind of looking at this as a book or a set of instructions. We have DNA within the chromosomes that live within our cells, and sometimes there are mutations or there's blips in the system. We have the instructions tell our little pieces of molecules and things what to turn on and what to turn off. They help us build and maintain our life, our living organism. And this is also potentially directly related to the food choices and lifestyle habits as to whatever we may be responsible for, or the things that are environmentally being exposed to, that they can modify a lot of these expression patterns or the way that these instructions are set up. So if you're reading information, I think a couple of months ago, and that's one of those things as well. Is your body in a state of constant inflammation? If so, what happens to the long-term effects of that, and how does that affect your cells? So just kind of keep this image in mind. Especially, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the cells and also about those things at the very end, those little red things at the end of your chromosomes called telomeres, in a second. I'll share with you here, why and how do we get older? How does this happen? We have what are known as the theories of aging. The 3 things listed here, I'll go into detail in a second. But again, keep in mind, these are theories. We can't necessarily prove one thing equals the other because obviously, again, there's a lot of moving parts. Every human is very different as to what we take inside, what we have outside, the different effects, and there's no real true level playing field for any one of us. So it's very hard for us to do research based on longevity when it comes to things that we're trying to theorize in that sense. So let's take a look at some of the theories listed here. The first one is called programmed aging. Program aging basically says that there is an expiration date for all of us. We get born and the clock starts ticking and counting down when we will eventually expire. Obviously, we'll talk a little bit to you about some of the outside effects that can be related to stuff like that, but we're talking genetically, those little switches that are turning on or off that are going to gradually decline in our bodily functions. And eventually, it's a natural process, according to this theory, that you're going to expire whenever that clock runs out. So think of this too when I'm going through this in the next few slides. Like, what makes sense to you? What are some of the theories that you're feeling are related to who you are, as I get into a little bit more detail with the other theories here. So we have the molecular clock theory. The molecular clock, a little different than what you just saw there with the programmed aging, but this is related to something called methylation. So if you remember that picture I just showed you, those telomeres at the end of your chromosomes kind of rub down and wear away, and they can shorten. And because of that, it's possible that that also affects changes in your DNA over time. It can lead to some gene function disruption, and that can then in turn cause you to be more at risk for chronic diseases, et cetera. So the fancy word that I'm using here, the methylation word that I'm using here, foods can donate to the methylation. Methylation is or I should say the methyl groups, for those of you who know chemistry, these are your CH3 groups, right? So your carbon, hydrogen molecules. And this is basically found in a lot of our produce and plant-based diets, which is why we see a lot of times us trying to promote those sort of eating behaviors, because that can add to the methylation and help those little telomeres maintain their existence and not have them rub away. The next thing here is called the wear and tear theory. So again, this is about accumulated damage over time. Again, if you remember the discussion around inflammation and oxidation and environmental stress, this could be anything from literally stressing out over something. So you're actively causing your body to be in a chronic state of stress, which is not good. You could also be living near a factory, so pollution in the air. You could be eating, ingesting, wearing certain toxic chemicals that do add up and build up over time. And these things will lead to what is known as cytotoxicity, a fancy word for cell death, the death of your cells. But I wanted to add in here too, the wear and tear theory also covers the live fast, die young philosophy, right? So people who kind of maybe do extreme sports or put themselves at risks for whatever, race car driving, that sort of thing, that can add to that chronic stress that your body is fighting underneath at a cellular level. And over time, again, this can damage and play a role in your maybe shorter lifespan. So I just want to take a moment here, again, another PSA to share with you to just beware of things like pills and supplements and skin creams and things like that, which try to give you the anti-aging effects of things that, yes, of course, they're made with chemical substances that may add to this, but it's really also on that cellular level. What are things that you're exposing yourself to? What are things that you're choosing to do, choosing to be around? What you have access to? Because with anything, a supplement is only going to enhance what is already existing, not take over and create some sort of miracle cure for something that you are dealing with. So just want you to, as an educated consumer, just be aware of some of the marketing terms that might be used when you see things like this. Okay, we're going to get into the blue zone discussion. I'm kind of excited right now because I know a lot of people have Netflix, and I think it's a 4-part series. So there's 4 1-hour-ish episodes. This is Dan Buettner. Dan Buettner is the American author and explorer who has kind of brought the blue zones to light and made them a little bit more popular. He's a traveler of the world. He's been doing a lot of writing and information sharing about this, but he's in no way a researcher. He's not a health and wellness provider. He actually, I was looking up some information about him, and I think he has a Spanish and international business major degree. So that's what he's got as far as his credentials are concerned. But he's traveled the whole globe doing a bunch of different things. And most recently, he's been focused on what's called these blue zones. So Netflix, as I'm getting back to what I was just saying, Netflix has, I think, a 4-part series where he goes through and he shows you the interviews that he's done around the world. And it's something that I've just started watching because I wanted to be prepared to share that with you for this discussion. And it's called Live to 100 Secrets of the Blue Zones. And the crux of what he's sharing with us is finding regions that share some similar factors that lead to a higher concentration of what are known as centenarians, which are people who live to at least the age of 100 or older. And we're talking, 3 to 10 times as many 100-year-old residents in these areas in comparison to the rest of the world, and of course with America too. But spoiler alert, there actually is a place in America where we do have a region like this. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about these zones. As you can see here, geographically speaking, from left to right, you have the California location, Costa Rica, Italy, Greece, and Japan. And I'm happy to ask you too, as I'm going through these zones, if you've ever traveled to these places, if you are from any of these places, if you're familiar with these places, please feel free to share your experiences so we can kind of get a little bit more of an interactive discussion taking place in here. We also noticed too, or Dan has also noticed in the information he's collected, that these people have suffered far less of risk issues through chronic illnesses, dementia. A lot of them have very smooth skin and all their teeth, things that you normally wouldn't consider as we're aging, because again, you dehydrate and things start wearing and tearing, or, more at risk for cell destruction, etc. We also have, I'll share too, in what he's kind of combined with the top factors, we have some information that I'll share with you too about what the definitions of that means too. So let's talk a little bit again from left to right. What we have: Loma Linda, California, that's in the USA. Some of their key factors of what they focus on in their community has to do with diet, lifestyle, and environment. It's Southern California, so it's on the coast, but this is actually a Seventh-day Adventist community. So there's a Christian denomination there. So they have a religious affiliation. I also did a little research on the background of this too. They promote vegetarian diets, but they are not exclusive. So some people may or may not follow vegetarian diets, but they definitely do abstain from things like alcohol, tobacco, and other substances. So we didn't necessarily talk about lifestyle factors, but that is a factor, not just diet and physical activity, but mental health and social connections, and then substance abuse, etc. So here we're talking about the healthcare system that they kind of enacted for themselves really does emphasize a more holistic approach and also prioritizes a lot of well-being and social connections. So this is a couple of little pictures that I found what Loma Linda looks like, kind of, open air, but it is a very urban place. It's not isolated in any way. They have access to highways and infrastructures just like we would do in any big city. But again, it's a little bit more of a structured community. And this is an example of some of the foods. A lot of things that you see here are quite recognizable in America too. Again, I threw in the picture with the chicken in it, but as I mentioned, they usually do focus more on a vegetarian diet, and some of them will completely go vegan or vegetarian and not necessarily include animal products. Then we switch over to Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica. If you've ever been to Costa Rica, I have. Very beautiful. Again, key factors that we see there, and this is a region on the Pacific coast of Costa Rica. And this is something to consider too, right? Like as you're looking, we're talking about concentrated little sections of places within other places. So not Costa Rica as a whole, but this very specific peninsula in Costa Rica that has that high concentration of centenarians. So here you can see, again, different terrains, right? Obviously, they're near the water, but they also have very lush rainforests and places that can allow them to walk and be in nature. This could be an example of a Costa Rican diet. They have beans, legumes, etc. They have pieces of what looks like meat there too. They have eggs and corn. And we'll talk a little bit too about some of the common threads that run along their diet. Then we jump over to Sardinia, Italy, which is a mountainous region, but it is located on an island. So again, it's on the Mediterranean area. So the Mediterranean comes into play when you talk about places in Europe like Italy and France and Greece, etc. And some of the key factors in Sardinia are listed here: diet, lifestyle, and social structure. Again, beautiful pictures from Sardinia, water features, mountainous areas, a lot of different terrains, open spaces. And here's an example of one of the Sardinian dishes, which includes, because they're close to the water, obviously, shellfish or seafood. They have grain-based meals as well. They also use a lot of different kinds of whole grains and bean-based dishes too. Then we jump to Icaria, Greece. Their key factors that keep them together are also related to diet, lifestyle, and social engagement. And this is a Greek island along the Aegean Sea. And here are some beautiful pictures. If you've ever been to Greece, this is very similar to a lot of other places like Santorini, et cetera, where you have those white white buildings with the blue tops, mountainous, but also near the water. So there, again, the terrain is very varied. They have a lot of open spaces, but they're also kind of densely populated in that particular region. And here again is an example of Icarian food. So you can see it's mostly plants in here. They might throw in some other, animal-based items, but they always start with some sort of bean, legume, or chickpea type of base in a lot of their dishes. Then we move over to Okinawa, Japan. Here we have, it's actually a group of islands in the southernmost part of Japan. So it's a whole little chain of islands strung together that is known as Okinawa. And again, their primary factors are diet, lifestyle, and spirituality. And again, right? So beautiful skies, beautiful region. Since it's an island, obviously it's going to be near water, but they also have terrain and lush scapes and areas that they can be outside with nature. Here's an example of one of their dishes where they use, again, very plant-based heavy bases. They can do tofu. They do a lot of sweet potato too. That's something that I learned also. They have a purple sweet potato that they use there too, very heavy starches, and I'll explain why some of that is as far as their staple items. Okay. Um, Before I go and talk about this, let me just, and this kind of ties in actually as I'm talking, but I want to give you some examples of some of the things that I was learning too. But what you see on screen here, what Dan Buettner did with all of his information that he collected, was he categorized 4 specific areas that seemed most prevalent around these 5 regions. Moving, so physical movement. Well, I can't see what it says here. Excuse me one sec. Let me just get this little window out of the way. Okay, the right outlook. So we're talking about purpose, values, and mission. Eating wisely. So again, that approach to mindful eating and social connections, engagement, etc. So he's divided those up into some subcategories too, but not every region does the exact same thing. So like I just mentioned, in Loma Linda, California, they abstain from alcohol, but in Ikaria, which is Greece, in Sardinia, Italy, in Okinawa, Japan, they have alcohol, they have wine, they have ouzo, they have sake, so they don't abstain from that, but they also rely heavily, and these are some of the things that I made as I was watching and learning about all these things. They rely heavily on being self-sufficient and very resourceful. So they're making their own food. A lot of these places are somewhat isolated as far as just geographically speaking. So they don't really have imports and exports and things. They have to rely on what is in their own backyard. They also rely very heavily on traditional ways of making their meals and working their, tilling their soil. So they do a lot of things by hand and things that are using, again, very traditional machinery or equipment. They're not using a lot of technologically advanced, convenient items, pieces of equipment that would get things done quicker. So they're spending a lot of time and energy physically getting things done, whether it's making wine for themselves or milling wheat and creating flour for their meals. They also have this sense of purpose, this characteristic of feeling important. So a place like Okinawa has gone through, as a lot of places have, war-torn places in their lives that could potentially cause a lot of stress and depression and lack of in their world, but they choose to have positive outlooks. So the words that they used in some of these regions, so in Japan, they called it ikigai, and in Costa Rica, they called it plan de vida, purpose of life. Like, what is my purpose? What am I getting up to do today? Why am I alive? And what's my willing to be? And I will say, as I'm talking to you, I'm feeling very emotional because as I was reading and watching some of the stuff about these blue zones, especially in comparison to where we live in New York City, it's a lot of stuff going on here. It's very high energy, not a lot of open spaces, obviously, but just, and then being an American, especially whatever age you're in, a lot of fast-paced things. I was getting sad because I thought to myself, I try very hard to lead and live with compassion. I try to be of service to others. I really try to focus on my purpose and my why. And it sometimes has nothing to do with, the money that I make and things. It's just to be of service. And then I know that I definitely have come across many, many people, especially recently, who tend to say things like, that's not my problem. Where in all of these regions, they rely on community. So I might not even be related to somebody in this region, but if they're going through a hardship, everybody pools together their resources, they group together and they provide socializing with this person to let them feel less isolated. It really touched my heart in so many ways that I didn't think, because I was just looking at like statistics and information and research and stuff, but it really struck an emotional chord. So I am, as we're coming upon the end of this year, I'm really trying to reconfigure how I want to lead and live, because obviously, well, maybe not obviously, I don't know if I can just up and move to Okinawa, Japan, and if that's just going to like undo all the potential cellular damage that has been done leading up to this point. But I'm going to try to see how I can abide by some of these things. And I'm also going to pay attention as to where some of those challenges are, like where I am responsible and what is kind of holding me up from moving forward with those things, and trying to shift my focus on some things. So self-sufficiency, resourcefulness, open spaces, isolated geographically, but not isolated in the personal sense. I mentioned the terrain, right? Mountains, sand, rocks, soil. These people are moving around every minute of every day. They're not going to the gym. They're not putting together a fitness routine. They're taking away the aspect of, working out you have to suffer, right? No pain, no gain, as Dan Buettner mentioned in the documentary. They're looking at it as a part of their lifestyle. Like, this is what I do. I go here, I walk up this hill, I climb up these stairs, and then I climb down those stairs, and then I go around the block to socialize, and then I take care of my garden, and then I go visit so and so who's selling me, dairy products out of his backyard. So all of these things are in combination that help with providing this like power nine, these factors that are shared with you here. I also saw some common approaches for food, the way that they use herbal remedies, but also in a sense of like herbal teas, drinking a lot of herbal teas and using herbs and spices in their meal preparation. Because again, as I shared with you in the inflammation webinar, these are anti-inflammatory properties, but they're also made from their backyard. So they're not necessarily taking things that are ground up at a large food supply or food manufacturer and buying it in a supermarket. It's all very natural and local to who and where they are. They also live, laugh, dance, joy. Laughter in itself provides a ton of benefits, right? It gets the oxygen, blood flowing, all these fun things. You kind of like live in positivity, and that in itself can deter or decrease the risk of chronic conditions too. So again, when I think of all of the people that I know, myself included, people with whom I work, people in my family, everybody's so miserable all the time. We're so sad all the time. We always have stress all the time. We complain constantly about everything. It's really hard for us to feel very upbeat and positive. And some of us dismiss that as like, yeah, because you're not being realistic. But I'm really taking a very internal and external look at that in the coming months as to why is that? Why can't I try to focus on the purpose and the positivity of things? How can I remove some of the negativity away from my life if that is something that I want to do? I want to help, live in a better position if I'm not going to move to Costa Rica. There was also things about, again, the ways that they're creating their food. So I mentioned, they're doing everything kind of by hand, and they're not doing anything that would be considered like, what is it called? Like additives and things that would be created to help sustain the life of a food product. So it's eaten within a certain period of time and then it's done. So it's very seasonal, very local. And the thing too, when it comes to food, especially in America, we're so anti-carbohydrates here, but all of the things that you saw just now in these regions are carbohydrate based. And we're talking starchy carbs, pasta, grain-based dishes. But again, it's because there's whole grains, there's a lot of fibrous foods. And as a lot of you, I'm sure know, when we eat those more fibrous foods, when we eat those very filling foods, they fill you up, they extend your belly. A lot of us don't love the sensation, but the way that the rest of the blue zones consider that is it helps them feel satisfied. They're like, oh, you know what? I can take a second just to kind of be mindful about this food. I'm not rushing through having 5 minutes of a real quick, burger or a snack or something that I'm just eating and being done with. I'm actually enjoying my meal and I'm being mindful of that and taking that into account. So give me a second here as I check through the chat. I think a few people might have chimed in. Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Far. So some of them, because of their religion, don't drink alcohol or certain foods. Exactly. Right. So there's dietary practices, whether it's a personal preference or you're following religious laws. So obviously, kosher, Islam, vegan vegetarianism with this Seventh Day Adventist, that might be something that they have to abide by. So that definitely plays a role in it. But again, just to create kind of like interest around not every quote unquote dietary rule is followed exactly in these other regions. So I just thought that was so interesting that some people are promoting alcohol as part of their daily food meals, and some people would never have that because they're following a particular dietary structure that doesn't allow them or asks them to abstain from alcohol in that particular example. So thank you for that. So yeah, so let's take a little bit of a slower look around this little power nine here, right? This whole thing around moving naturally. So not forcing yourself to go to a gym or not making it feel like a chore, but really tidying up your home is a movement. The goal is to stay active in some way and not be sedentary, not just lay down and recline, but to be up and engage and active. And even the things that you have in your household, or things like, water bottles, canned goods, the thing I mentioned before about rolling out the dough of stuff. We don't do that. We throw everything in a blender, stick it in a hot pot, throw it into an air fryer, we're done. We don't really have that hands-on tactile movement sometimes that can help lend to extending our lives. The right outlook about the purpose and kind of downshifting and managing stress. Again, a big thing around here too. A lot of people may or may not have access to therapy, may or may not believe in sharing some of the things that they are stressed out about. So they internalize those things and they don't necessarily look towards something about either putting their faith in a higher power or allowing themselves to be able to get that support if they need it. So the quote unquote right outlook takes a place there too. In the Eat Wisely section, we have something called this 80-20 rule. So according to Okinawans, they have a term about they eat until they're not yet done. So they allow some space for digestion, for breathability, versus what we tend to do. And again, this has to do with caloric and nutrient density from what I was learning as I was putting this presentation together. As I said before, right, the foods that are a little starchy, carby, grain-based, beans, etc., they're going to feel filling. They're going to fill you up sooner. So you're probably not going to want to overeat versus something that might be calorically dense, but not nutrient dense, as we tend to say, quote unquote, empty calories here that we tend to snack on, or we go through fast foods and we literally eat them fast and we're not giving ourselves a chance to kind of slow down and just let our bodies digest. So that was an approach that was uh, cited here in some of these factors. The plant slant, so again, promoting plant-based diets, that's all listen, if you don't know this by now, it's beneficial, okay? I don't think I have to go through that too much. And the wine at 5, so here's where I was like, it's not necessarily applicable across all of the regions, but that was something that they said, but it was also the way that they made and the way that they drank their wine. So it was done in a social setting and it was done because they were actually producing it. It wasn't like they were going out and buying, 10 bottles of whatever and going crazy at the end of the night. The connection part. So here too, especially as we're aging, this is really the hard thing too, especially as we're aging, we might be losing people, whether they're dying or as we're aging, we're outliving the other people around us. Their life expectancy isn't as long as ours might be. So we might not be able to find that ability to stay social, or we might have families for one reason or other who don't necessarily engage in respecting their elders or checking in on their older seniors of their families. Again, everybody, comes with their own experiences and backgrounds and stuff. So no judgment on this, but how do we help people who are getting older get more involved in things? And no offense to retirement homes and nursing homes, but that might not be the option because we do see some, statistically speaking, people do tend to even feel more isolated in those conditions. And again, in America, this could be a healthcare discussion too. And how do we get people feel like they have a sense of belonging, that they are able to share and again, congregate in that way that keeps their minds open to that. So let me check in the chat again here. Thank you very much. Oh, thanks, Far. Thank you. If anybody else has any things that you want to share, because I'm going to take the next couple of minutes just to go through a few things that I want to say about this. All sounds great and lovely, but let's be realistic about some of the things in our world right now. So let's take a look at some of the stuff I want to share with you. Not to put a damper on anything, just to kind of get the conversation going. So and just also a side note, some of the stuff I'm sharing with you in the next coming slides, I'll talk a little bit more about that in some of our future webinars. So the first thing to recognize is, when we are born, we have this thing called like an innate ability to regulate our intake. We know when we're hungry, we know when we're full. We cry and then we spit up, right? It's only after the age of like 2 or 4 that all of that stuff starts getting affected by external factors. And of course, in the larger scheme of things, access to stuff and quality, quantity of foods, etc. But also as we age, we might be suffering from chronic conditions, multiple of them. We might have surgeries, we might be recovering from injuries, we might have many, many pharmaceuticals that we're taking that is just messing with our system, and we're no longer able to really focus on how to be mindful. Some of us in the later stages of life too might just completely have no appetite. That's something that just naturally goes away with as we age. So the eating model that you see here is something that I'll talk about in our next month's discussion about mindfulness, mental health, and trying to get back to that ability to recognize our hunger and fullness cues. But even then, we might still have to kind of come up with more of a routine to make sure that we're eating and how we can eat and what feels satisfying to us. So this is just kind of like a little sneak peek of what we're going to talk about next month. This thing here too, as we age, we become just naturally more immunocompromised because our guts become a little bit more deteriorated, and that lowers our immunity capabilities. So we have to make sure we're also teaching our older population or anybody who might be considered immunocompromised about food safety. So it's great if you want to cook and eat at home, but just make sure that you are washing and sanitizing your prep surfaces, you're using different cutting boards for different things, and you're refrigerating or storing certain foods and getting rid of certain foods when they are past their expiration date. If you go back to the dining out webinar that I did a few months ago, we talked a little bit more in detail about that. So there are resources for you to learn about that too, but we'll talk as we progress in some of our discussions. I'll keep kind of bringing this back in. All of this to say, right, you could be doing all the things right, but then, as you know, right, there's food recalls, or you might make a mistake and cross-contaminate something, and that could set off a chain reaction of making you sick or putting you at risk for a foodborne illness. And then last but not least, it would really be a disadvantage if I didn't also include, and again, with the caveat of if you have access to high quality healthcare, health insurance, or clinics that may accommodate people who don't have things like health insurance, going for screenings. Every life cycle has some recommendations as to how often you should go to stuff, right? You have like mammogram checks, and then you have bone density scans, and then you have heart stress tests and so on. So taking a look as we get into our later years of keeping up with our regular physical exams to make sure that things aren't progressing to get worse, or that we're managing things that we're currently doing, going for skin checks to make sure there's no weird moles appearing, or even what's called the turgidity or the turgor, making sure that we're not, drying out or having edema build up. This is water retention, fluid retention. So you can see on here too some of the things that are recommended as far as screenings are concerned when we get to be in our older years. All right, so all of that in consideration, are we all booking a trip? Where are we going? Are we going to Okinawa? Where are we going to go? Nicoya, Costa Rica? Where do you want to go? What are you planning on doing with all the information that I just shared with you in potentially being able to extend your life? If you want to live as long as as long as possible, what are some things that you want to start doing? Because like I said, it's just mid-September and I already got my gears going. I'm not waiting until the new year to start up some new practices and approaches. What are things that you're doing already that you're like, I'm already following some of those 9 things. I'm going to keep on doing those things. And what are some things that are no longer serving you that you think you might want to time to get rid of, whether it's people, places, or things, right? We just talked a little bit about socializing. Maybe people in your social circle don't make you feel so great. So maybe it's time to break up with those people and find yourself some new friends. All right, my friends, Next month, we're going to talk about, as I said, gave you a little teaser there, mental health, mindful eating, talking about how some mental health stressors can affect our food choices and also affect our health in general. That's going to be Tuesday, October 8th at 1 p.m. I will definitely send the link to register for that next month's webinar when you get the post-event link for the recording and all the other stuff that I send you after this event is over. Again, give me about like two to 5 days and I'll get all that information out to you. So thanks for everyone who has joined. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback that you want to throw into the chat right now, please feel free to do so as I'll stay on for another couple of minutes. And if not, I bid you adieu and I will see you hopefully in the next webinar. Thanks so much for coming, everybody. Thank you. Bye, everyone.